Hi, my name is Darpan Sodhi, and I will be giving a presentation about what I have learned through Project 2 with my topic focused on heuristics and biases in decision making. Within this presentation, I will review the publications evaluated through this project, the fundamental concepts I learned about heuristics and biases, how the papers I looked at evaluated heuristics and biases from both a business and medical perspective, as well as how heuristics and biases can be viewed in both positive and negative ways. Also, at the end of this presentation, I would like to provide a real-life example where I noticed after learning all of these concepts through this project that I myself used heuristics and biases when making decisions. Next, I wanted to note that there were 9 specific citations I was focused on within my report. The 3 citations here were what I read to understand the background of heuristics and biases in decision making. Next, though I went into depth on what I learned from the 6 other articles I chose for my written report, in this presentation I will talk about the main concepts I learned about decision making from these 3 publications pointed out here. First off, I want to give an overview of my understanding of heuristics and biases in decision making from the background readings I did before I talk about specific heuristics and biases I found through publications. Within the first chapter of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about how our mind may have 2 systems, where System 1 is focused on making a decision in the quickest manner where no effort is required, and System 2 is focused on putting more effort to have our mind understand what is occurring better to come to a decision. Following this, the first few publications I read were focused on defining what heuristics and biases are in decision making. Heuristics are thought of as shortcuts that our brain may take to make decisions and can cause cognitive biases. Heuristic biases in decision making can help a person make the decision quicker, but it may also lead to errors in the decision making process. As I go further in this presentation, I will talk about specific heuristics and biases that I found important in the context where they were proven to be good or bad to use to come to a final decision. One article I found interesting was a publication focusing on the difference in heuristics and biases of entrepreneurs and managers, where the hypothesis was that entrepreneurs use heuristics and biases of overconfidence and representativeness more than managers. First off, overconfidence is defined as a condition in which the decision maker believes that the original information that they know is sufficient to conduct an evaluation of the decision situation, and because of this, they may not easily consider getting more information that may be available for the decision-making process. They may not even recognize how much uncertainty there is in the data they choose to use in their decision-making process because of this. To test this, each participant was asked the same 5 factual questions with an option A or B to choose as an answer. Then they had to rate their confidence level from 0.5 to 1. The higher the value they gave, the more confidence they had that they are right. The data showed that the entrepreneur participants had more conditions than managers where they were more confident about how correct they were compared to how many times they actually gave the correct answer. This means they had more overconfidence than managers. Next, the representativeness bias was tested. Representativeness is when a decision maker generalizes the information about a person or idea based on only a few characteristics or features they may know about them. In this study, each participant was provided with scenarios with 2 alternative options to choose from, one focusing on statistical data and one focused on heuristics and biases related data. It was documented what specific data each participant used to make their decision on choosing the best alternative. The results of this study showed that entrepreneurs had more representativeness in their decision-making than managers. Through reading this article, there were a few key points I learned about heuristics and biases in decision-making. First off, though heuristics and biases are seen as a way of overlooking potential data necessary to make the best decision, sometimes they're unavoidable because of what data is realistically available in the real world. For instance, assumptions many times have to be made about future events since there is no data to prove what will actually happen. Next, it was clearly noted within the article that there is a clear differentiation between the decision-making process of managers and entrepreneurs based on the amount of uncertainty they are presented with. This may be why entrepreneurs are generally noted to use heuristics and biases in decision-making more than managers. Since managers have the ability to look at the history of the large organization that they are a part of, there is a higher level of certainty that they can gain within their decision process with facts compared to entrepreneurs. Though both managers and entrepreneurs may have some level of uncertainty before making a decision, it is shown that entrepreneurs seem to have more uncertainty overall. Within the discussion of this paper, it's also noted that though it could be concluded that entrepreneurs overall showed more heuristics and biases in decision-making, this was inconclusive as to how much less managers use heuristics and biases in decision-making than entrepreneurs. Based on my understanding, data only showed that in general, managers had lower usage of heuristics and biases in decision-making than entrepreneurs, but there was no way to give an explicit value of how much exact usage it is, as it may depend on the context of the decision significantly. Next, I looked at a publication specific to heuristics and biases used in decision-making within a medical environment. There were two main studies conducted in this paper. The first one was a pilot study, where a survey was given to medical practitioners to rate which heuristics and biases they thought were the most used within intensive care units and emergency rooms. In this, the top 5 heuristics and biases clinicians indicated were present within the ICU and ER were availability, deformation professional, in-group bias, planning fallacy, and anchoring and adjustment. Availability refers to a situation where the decision maker gives a higher probability to an event that their mind can remember more easily. Deformation professional is where one only looks at the narrowed down view specific to their profession rather than looking at a broader view. An in-group bias is where one believes that those who are part of their particular group are more preferred than others that are not within their group. In the medical setting, this may be a condition such as a physician prefers to believe the comments of another physician more than the comments of a nurse. A planning fallacy is where the individual thinks it will take less time to complete a task than it actually will due to over-optimism. Anchoring and adjustment is when you are provided an initial starting value and are making adjustments based on that initial value to make a decision. Next, this paper talks about a live session study conducted where medical practitioners were recorded for 3-hour intervals as they were making decisions in critical care settings. Within this study, the top heuristics and biases identified were anchoring and adjustment, confirmation bias, availability, search satisficing, and deformation professional. A confirmation bias is when the decision maker focuses on looking for information that leans towards validating the hypothesis that they are trying to prove, rather than also looking further to see if or when there is evidence against the hypothesis. Search satisficing is where further search is stopped when certain data is found and no further work goes into seeing if the proper conclusion was made from the limited data taken or not. Through reading this article, there were a few key points I learned about heuristics and biases in decision making. In a medical setting, I learned how important the time constraint is to identify in the process of making the optimal decision. Many times, especially in emergency situations, doctors don't have the optimal time to conduct a deep analysis to come to the optimal decision. If there is a time constraint on the patient's health, there may not be any other choice than to use the tools of heuristics and biases in decision making. I thought it was important to note that the heuristics and biases can be beneficial or improper to use based on the context. In the context of medicine, I can see why this can be a very important issue to bring up because based on the level of severity of a patient's health, heuristics and biases can directly impact proper treatment given to patients. However, clinicians are constantly under the time constraint that are set by patients' health itself, so they may have no other choice than to use heuristics and biases to make a decision. This is also the first medical study related to heuristics and biases that I read directly focused on working in a real-world environment rather than bringing subjects to a laboratory. And I saw how this can help view the idea of heuristics and biases differently and more realistically, and as something we deal with every day. I also learned about quite a few additional heuristics and biases that I wasn't aware of, such as the deformation professional, in-group bias, planning fallacy, search satisficing, and confirmation bias, as these were clearly shown within the evaluations in this publication. This really taught me that there are a wide range of heuristics and biases that can be used by humans in decision-making processes. Next, I was interested at looking at a publication specific to an automated system to detect the presence of heuristics and biases in decision-making. This article talks about a computer-based system to evaluate a pathologist's decision-making process when evaluating microscopic slides related to subepidermal vascular dermatitis and nodular and diffuse dermatitis. The computer system was programmed to identify 8 types of heuristics or biases during hypotheses, actions, and diagnoses, or in other words, decisions. This included anchoring, availability, confirmation bias, gambler's fallacy, representativeness, search satisficing, and overconfidence or underconfidence. As I talk about how these were tracked by the system, I will define the heuristics and biases that weren't mentioned in the previous slides. An anchoring bias was identified by the system if an initial incorrect hypothesis created was not adjusted based on data collected that went against it. The availability bias was identified by the system if the participant created an incorrect diagnosis that was similar to cases that were just presented to them in the experiment. A confirmation bias was identified by the system if the participant made a wrong diagnosis and then used evidence provided to try and support the diagnosis even if it was wrong. A gambler's fallacy is when one believes that after one event occurs continuously, the opposite thing is more likely to occur. This was detected by the system if one of the participants diagnosed a case wrong, even though it was similar to diagnoses cases that came before it in the time period of the experiment. Representativeness was a unique heuristic bias in the study because it was tracked by the computer system only if the participant repeated a finding-diagnosis combination at least twice in the study. Search satisficing was tracked by the computer system by identifying if an incorrect diagnosis was made from the data given without asking for further data or if the diagnosis was missing elements due to not searching for further data after the current data was provided. At the end of the final decision made by the decision maker, the decision maker stated if they are confident or not in their decision, and based on if their diagnosis was correct or incorrect, the decision maker was defined as overconfident or underconfident. Through the studies conducted with 71 participants ranging in levels of expertise in pathology, the heuristics and biases that stood out to lead to incorrect diagnoses were search satisficing, anchoring, availability, along with overconfidence. Through this article, I learned how important it can be to wait until the end of the experiment or a certain decision stated to make the participant aware of a heuristic or bias present so that the computer system's processing didn't change the natural decision-making process of the pathologists themselves. It was interesting that the limitations that heuristics and biases bring had to be considered in how the computer system was programmed itself to ensure it captured the natural ways that humans use heuristics and biases in decision-making. I also noted after reading this article that the computer program interpretation is still dependent on the human's discrete definition of each heuristic and bias. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the computer system was programmed to track specific actions taken by the decision maker to determine if a heuristic or bias was present and how to categorize the heuristics and biases. From my perspective, this could lead to the system's interpretation of each decision not being completely objective. Rather, it would be subjective based on the specific individuals who programmed the computer system to detect certain actions and decisions. It also seems to me that since this program was limited to tracking 8 specific heuristics and biases, there was no way to identify if there were other heuristics and biases being used by the decision maker at every step along with what was detected with the computer system. The author also states that this system could be helpful as a training source to make medical practitioners more aware of heuristics and biases in the future. I thought that this was very useful of an outcome from this study because as I learned all of these concepts, I've seen that the simple awareness of the heuristics and biases overall can increase your ability to identify if you have those present in your decision-making process itself. So training could be a useful tool to improve or reduce the improper use of heuristics and biases in decision-making. After reading through the various publications, and now that I am more aware of how much humans use heuristics and biases every day, I wanted to look at a real-life scenario I am in right now to see if I'm actually using these heuristics and biases in decision-making. While I only identify a few within this slide, I elaborate on more heuristics and biases I identified using within my written report. I've recently started looking into deciding on a house to purchase, and I found that there are a few key heuristics and biases that I have been using and was able to identify them based on what I have learned through reading and learning from all of these publications. First off, one of the most important factors that I take into consideration when moving is the public schools that are within the frame of the house that I buy. Simply based on my past experiences, I only knew of one school district because that is a school district that I grew up in and that I went to school in. I will refer to this as District A. I only looked up reviews of this school district and the high schools in District A and found it had great reviews. This made me automatically come to the conclusion that District A is the best district to plan on moving to. This shows that I clearly use the confirmation bias to only look for evidence that District A has good ratings, instead of trying to also look at if there's evidence showing otherwise or other statistical data about good versus bad characteristics about District A, or even looking at if there are other districts that rate better or have features that District A doesn't. This also shows that I used the availability bias, because since District A was the first district to come to my mind, I believe that this was a district that had the higher probability of being the best district I could choose a house to live in, rather than looking at other districts and gathering full data about each district first. With all of this, I want to note that I really appreciate learning about the presence of these heuristics and biases in this specific decision-making process, because it will help me try to reduce or even try to eliminate the use of heuristics and biases as much as possible in order to ensure I gather all essential information to come to a rational and proper decision. It has made me more aware of how the concepts of heuristics and biases can be used within both my personal and professional decisions. Next, just for your reference, here are all the citations I refer to within this presentation and more in detail within my written report. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.